Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. So today's session will be led by Anna Denham, who works for Disability Rights UK as our Partnerships and Communications Officer for the Get Yourself Active programme. So she will be taking you through what the main challenges are that you may face when using co-production approaches and discussing how you can try to move past some of these. So just as a little introduction while we're still waiting for some people to join, I'll tell you a bit more about us at Disability Rights UK. So we're a user-led pan-disability charity. We exist to build leadership and power amongst disabled people to create a movement for change. Our charitable objectives include breaking the link between disability and poverty and enabling disabled people to achieve independence and control over their own lives. The majority of our staff and trustees also have lived experience of disability. And Get Yourself Active is a programme that's funded by Sport England and led by Disability Rights UK. We work alongside disabled people to lead change in the social care, health and sports sectors in order to improve health and wellbeing outcomes for disabled people. So co-production is a really important part of the work we do, and we are working closely with other disabled people, user-led organisations and the sports sector to embed co-production in practice, ensuring that the sports sector works effectively with disabled people to co-produce solutions to inactivity. And the webinar today is just one of the many topics we are covering over the next couple of months. We are hosting a number of short webinars once a week covering a range of important topics all to do with co-production. The aim of these sessions is to support more organisations in both the sports sector and disability sector to understand the basics of co-production, as well as sharing good practice on effectively embedding co-production in practice. So we'll also be recording these sessions and uploading them onto our website. So feel free to visit our website and view the timetable for the webinars and to watch recorded sessions after they are live. And just to let you know, this is only a short session, so up to about 15-20 minutes. So we won't have any time to do any Q&A. However, if you do have any questions, feel free to email me and we can get back to you. I'll add my email address to the chat box below. So I'm now going to stop talking and pass over to Anna, who's going to begin the session. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Liddy, for the introduction. Hi, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us this morning. So last week, you'll hopefully have tuned in and listened to my colleague, Leanne Whiteman, who spoke to us about the benefits of co-production. And I'm going to follow on from that today and talk you through some of the challenges of co-production. As Leanne mentioned last week, co-production has lots of merits and it's certainly the right way of working in the health and social care and sports sectors. But we do know that it can be difficult to actually put into practice. However, it's only by looking at some of the stumbling blocks and talking about ways forward that we can overcome those challenges. And I just want to mention here before we start that because this is only a short session, as Liddy's just mentioned, we're just going to look at some of the most common challenges. We've chosen 5 that we kind of think are the most common, reoccurring challenges in co-production. But hopefully you'll tune into some of our further sessions that we have lined up in the coming weeks on co-production. And by listening to those, particularly when we hear from some local organisations who'll share examples of co-production in practice, you'll be able to pick up perhaps some of the other challenges that you might come across and how you can work through those. So on to our first challenge, which is understanding what co-production means and dealing with differences in understanding. So next slide, please, Liddy, thanks. So there are various definitions and translations of co-production, and it can be difficult to therefore understand, let alone actually do. And that's probably where the first problem lies, really. That's when a group of people come together to co-produce something, but they all have a different understanding of what co-production means, what it involves. And because of that, they have quite different expectations of the process. If you ask an organisation or an individual to take part in co-production with you, it's quite likely that they'll expect to be an equal partner in whatever it is that you're planning or designing. So if you just send them a questionnaire or invite them to look at some plans as a one-off, they're probably going to be quite disappointed, and rightly so. It's only really co-production in the strictest sense if everyone is contributing equally and is included from the outset and right throughout the process. Sometimes it's okay just to consult on one aspect of something, But if that's the case, you do need to be clear about that, and you probably shouldn't label that piece of engagement or collaboration as co-production. So how can you move forward? On to the next slide, please, Liddy, thanks. Well, you can start by looking at the co-production ladder, and there are various resources available online about that. And of course, Liddy's going to be taking us through that next week in some more detail, so please do listen in next week. Be clear about what you understand co-production to mean, and make sure that you all have a shared understanding of the process. It might even be worthwhile drawing up an informal agreement, such as a memo of understanding, so that everyone is clear about what it is you're aiming to achieve, how you're going to do that, and to make sure that everyone has the same understanding of their individual role in the process. And it's quite likely to be at this point that you'll notice if the partnership doesn't seem equal and actually looks a bit more like consultation rather than proper co-production. I think we've all been partway through a project or a piece of work when someone's put their hand up and said, hang on a minute, I thought we were doing it this way, or I thought we were hoping to achieve this. So it's really important to be clear about vision and goals and processes, and make sure that everyone is behind those at the very beginning, so that you don't have those hang on a minute moments partway through the process. TLAP, which is Think Local, Act Personal, suggests that if you're new to co-production, you should start with a small project and then build on your successes, almost a pilot really. And this will give you an opportunity to test it out and to learn what works and what doesn't work. And training can also be really helpful, particularly if you attend the training together. I worked on a co-production research project a couple of years ago, and one of the success stories I witnessed was of a local authority who were commissioning a mental health support service. And the commissioners and the service users who were working on that together attended co-production training together at the very start. And that meant that they all had a shared understanding of what co-production means and what was expected of them. But it was also a really good way of kickstarting their working relationship. And of course, these speedy co-production webinars are a really good starting point in terms of training. And if anyone is interested in any further training, please do let Liddy know, because that's something we are going to be offering, and particularly aimed at the sports sector. So on to our next slide and our next challenge, which is no capacity or short timescales. Now, these are common challenges or misconceptions really. It can seem like too much hard work to involve other people when you're already pressed for time and you've got competing deadlines. However, as my colleague Evan Adele pointed out a few weeks back, often all that's needed in terms of your time and your resources is just to meet over a cup of tea and to have an informal conversation. Co-production shouldn't really prolong anything or stop you from meeting deadlines. It's simply about having people on board with you who are experts, who have lived experience, and who can bring ideas to the table. And actually, if you don't work with people from the start, it's much more likely you'll have to spend far longer trying to refine a service for service users who you'd only worked with from the outset. You'd have saved a lot of time, money, and energy on both sides to get it right in the first instance. So, how can you move forward? If we go on to our next slide, thanks, Liddy. Well, it's important to be realistic and open and honest about deadlines and budgets, and don't set expectations too high in terms of what might be achieved from the project. Just be clear and make sure that everyone is aware and understands the limitations. And that's far more likely to build trust too, which is a really important part of co-production. I can't stress that enough, and I'll touch on trust a couple of more times in this webinar this morning. And if you are pushed for time, or if you do have limited resources, you might already have a really good working relationship with a local organisation. And all that's needed then is to perhaps build on something that you're already working on together. So it's likely you'll already have trust and understanding with that organisation, and that can save a lot of time in the long run, because often the first few meetings in co-production are about getting to know each other and building up trust. So if you start with a small project, as TLAP suggests, and if you work with an organisation that you already have a relationship with, it will be a bit easier and you will save a little bit of time. Now I'm going to cover the next two challenges together. If we can move on to the next slide, thanks. And that's because the methods for overcoming these challenges are quite closely linked. So the first challenge, bureaucracy and attitudes. Co-production's often between, as we know, a statutory organisation and a grassroots or community group. So, for example, it could be a local authority and a disabled people's user-led organisation working together to commission a new inclusive sports facility or service in the community. And it's often the statutory organisation that will have more constraints. So they'll be the ones to set the budget, they'll be accountable for that, they'll have deadlines to meet probably, and staff might be expected to adhere to certain rules and protocols. And all of these things can make, working with other groups feel like too much hard work or just not worth the effort. And it can really then make breaking out of that mould feel almost impossible to do. And coupled with that, with bureaucracy and attitudes, is this issue of power. If we could move to the next slide, thanks, Liddy. So if a statutory organisation and a local grassroots group have traditionally had a very professional and formal working relationship, and it's always felt on both sides, to be honest, that the statutory organisation has the power, it can be very difficult to move away from that towards a new normal where everyone shares the power. And that's difficult, especially if there's any distrust or cynicism on either side. And it can feel difficult, odd, even worrying to suddenly relinquish some power over to another group, particularly if it's a group who traditionally have felt in a very different sphere to your organisation or very much apart from your organisation. But acknowledging and accepting that both groups are equal and share the power really is an important step to doing co-production properly. So, how can you move forward? Well, it's perfectly natural for there to be some resistance to doing things differently. That's human nature, or to having to share the power in the relationship. And of course, this is going to lead to some conflict. But it's important to acknowledge this at the start and not to be deterred when it does happen. Conflict will happen, and that's perfectly natural, and it's actually a very important part of co-production. Just be committed to working through the entire co-production process, conflict included, and accepting that there will be highs and lows along the way, and that's just part of the process. And as I mentioned earlier, trust is absolutely essential to co-production. So you need to have honesty and transparency around the project that you're working on. And I mentioned an example earlier of a local authority where commissioners were working with some service users to commission a new mental health support service. The commissioners entrusted service users with some documents that were vital to the tendering process. And I know that these are the kind of documents that local authorities wouldn't usually share with the public, with service users. And I know that other local authorities that I'd worked with on this research project certainly wouldn't have done that. But the commissioners that I spoke with said they felt they had to give the service users all the relevant documentation they needed if they were truly going to commission a service in partnership. They just explained the importance of confidentiality and trusted the service users with the information. And in return, the service users did keep the information confidential. And they told me they felt truly equal in the partnership and the entire process, which not only meant that the co-production experience was really positive for everyone, but the final outcome was really positive, and they produced a service which met the needs of the service users. And of course, it's worth mentioning here that trust goes both ways. So it's not just about a statutory authority or organisation trusting members of the public, but if you're bringing on board people who have lived experience, they're quite often going to be trusting you with their personal stories or with personal information. So they are expecting that same trust in return. And I've also seen it really pay off when commissioning organisations take the time out to ask people, when is a good time to meet? Do you have a preferred location? It can be a really good idea to take it in turns to host meetings or to meet at a neutral location, such as a leisure centre, community centre, or a local coffee shop. People usually feel much more comfortable in their own or in a neutral territory. And that's all about kind of sharing and relinquishing some of that power. It's also good to make sure there is more than one person from each organisation at meetings, so that lots of viewpoints are taken on board and no one's dominating. And just as I've been doing here, when you see or hear of good examples, share them. Don't keep them to yourself. It's so easy to say when something isn't done well and to criticise, but let other people know when you think they are doing it right and when you do appreciate their efforts. And please share the examples of good co-production and how to do co-production effectively. On to our final challenge, which is involving people whose voices are rarely heard, which of course is something fundamental to what we do here at Disability Rights UK. So you might be really keen to work with a particular group, but find that's not as straightforward as you anticipated. People might not understand what it is you're trying to do or where they fit in the process. It could even be something as fundamental as some people lack confidence or some of the skills that are needed to work with you on something, which could just be reading and understanding some documents or giving a small presentation. Engaging with certain groups might seem daunting, particularly if there are barriers. So, for example, not everyone's on the internet, some people don't have English as a first language, but these might be people who rarely have an opportunity to participate. So I would say that's all the more reason to reach out to those people and to encourage them to co-produce with you. So how can you move forward? Well, this goes back to that idea of perhaps starting with an organisation or a contact that you already have a good relationship with. You can work with them to find out what might encourage people to participate. Test out your ideas and messages with them first before you take the plunge. And, you know, if you do host an event or call a meeting and find that people haven't turned up, you can ask those representatives from those organisations, you know, why might that be? Was the time of day that you chose no good? Was the venue inaccessible? Would people rather meet informally in a cafe or on Zoom to start with, which, you know, we're all doing that now. We're all working virtually at the moment. So that might be something that becomes much more accessible in the future. And if you're thinking of meeting with a particular cohort, you need to make sure that what you're suggesting is not only accessible, but appealing to them too. And that could be hosting a virtual meeting if it's for young adults or for teenagers. It could be having a guest speaker, providing some refreshments. Don't forget, people are going to be giving up their time, usually unpaid. So you need to think of a pleasant, accessible location and offer lunch, or at the very least, offer some refreshments. And always be inclusive. Don't set things up that by default will exclude anyone. And again, working with a community organisation here can really help with this. It also might be worth investing in some extra resources. For example, an independent facilitator, someone who's experienced at running the kind of sessions you're going to be holding, where you'll come together and talk about your desired outcomes and how you're going to do that. And that facilitator probably is someone who's quite experienced at supporting individuals who might lack confidence and need some extra support. So it's definitely worth considering that too. And vouchers or a small thank you gift at the end of the process would probably be very welcome. And above all, do offer to keep in touch and feedback to people how the project has turned out and what difference their input has made. People want to feel valued and appreciated, and it all helps to make people feel that they're equal in the process. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, offer to meet people on their territory. Not only does that show that you're happy to relinquish some power, but you're more likely to meet people at a location that's accessible and convenient to them, that will put them at ease and will avoid excluding anyone. So before I hand back to Liddy, hopefully today you've picked up what some of the most common key challenges are in co-production. And just to recap, those are making sure that everyone's on the same page, be honest and open with people, trust and respect each other, everyone is equal and important in the process, and remember the little things that can go a long way, and that is thinking about the time of day, the location, the refreshments, and is everyone welcomed and supported to participate. So I hope those tips have helped you and that you'll be able to use those in co-production going forwards. And I just want to end on something that I once heard, and that is that good co-production leads to more co-production. So although it is difficult and there are some challenges, hopefully I've demonstrated today that's perfectly normal, And those challenges are not insurmountable, but they are definitely worth working through. Thanks for listening, and I'll hand back over to Liddy now.
Thank you, Anna. That was a really interesting session, and I'm sure some of you will be able to relate to some of these challenges that Anna's just spoken through, and hopefully some of the tips have helped you as well for the future. So, as Anna mentioned, these are just some of the main challenges that you may come across, as we couldn't cover absolutely everything in a short session, but feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions about any other challenges you're facing. So, Anna also mentioned the co-production ladder in this session, which I will be talking about in more detail in next week's webinar, which will take place next Wednesday at 11 AM. The registration links are now available on our website. And we also have a couple of additional registration dates now available. So these will be talking about co-production in practice and delivered by Community Catalysts and Dance Syndrome. So make sure you book on early to avoid being disappointed. We're also still looking for organisations that have some examples of good practice in co-production approaches or any case studies, so that we can demonstrate co-production in practice. So if you have any examples that you would like to share with us, or know any organisations that do, please let me know by email. This will be really useful. And when you exit, you should be sent to a page with a quick survey to complete. So if you could take 2 minutes to complete this, we'll be really grateful, as this is going to be useful for developing and rolling out our training in the future. Thanks again, everyone, for taking part, and we hope to see you again next week.